Welcome back to part 2 of I Catch Killers with our guest, Dr Mindi Sotiri, a real social justice warrior. Is it okay calling you that?
It's fine.
I think it's pretty cool, no? In part 1, we're getting a sense of who Mindy is and the passion she has for reforming the criminal justice system. In part 2, we're going to talk about the work she does with the Restorative Justice Initiative.
Justice Reform Initiative.
Justice Reform Initiative. I can't even read my own writing. Okay. All right. So before we get into that, I just want to talk about some statistics. So we've got roughly, and this is fairly recent, 12,707 adults incarcerated in New South Wales prisons, which is the greatest incarceration in the country. 40% of New South Wales inmates are reconvicted in 12 months of release. That's pretty high recidivist.
It's really high, and it's actually even higher if you were to take a photograph of everybody in prison today.
Yeah,
it would be about 70% of people in prison today have been in prison before. So there's that many, 40% sort of reconvicted after a year, 50% return to prison after 2 years. But in terms of people who are currently in prison, about 70% of people in prison today have been there before.
So that you would say that's not working? It's
definitely not working.
So what's your is that why I think your catchphrase is jail's failing?
Yeah, jailing's failing.
Jailing's failing.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, there's lots of reasons why jailing is failing, but the fact that so many people that go to prison end up back in prison is absolutely one of the things that we need to be looking at. I think that, if our school systems were sort of failing in that way.
If we're spitting out students that couldn't read or write,
weren't educated,
we'd be saying something's wrong.
We would be saying something's wrong. Same as hospitals, if that many people were sort of, if you're saying, look, the intent of prison is to promote community safety, to rehabilitate, to deter people from committing crime.
Run that past again. Just break it. What you think the role of prison?
We've got this kind of legislative framework that says there are a number of reasons why judges and magistrates send people to prison.
Yeah, and
one of them is rehabilitation.
Yeah, okay.
One of them is deterrence. So, and that's deterrence for all of us in the community, but also
rehabilitation and deterrence. So that's not working if we
know that those aren't working. Yeah. And then protection of the community,
right,
or sort of community safety.
Yeah.
Now, we know that there is no relationship between imprisonment and community safety on a broader sense. We might be able to see some differences in community safety. Say if somebody's been a really prolific
serial rapist,
and they go to prison, then absolutely there's you're going to see, because of that person's incarceration, and an improvement in community safety. But if we look at the whole system and the numbers of people coming in and out of prison, and we look at crime rates, there is actually no relationship between our incarceration rates and what's happening for people in prison and crime. Yeah. In fact, what we've got is this very weird situation in Australia where over the last, since about 2003, between 2003 and 2018, we've had this incredible increase in the numbers of people that we send to prison. The only countries in the world...
And what period of time was that?
So it's close to 20 years.
Okay.
But between 2003 and 2018. And by the way, I'm quoting the Productivity Commission here, so it's not like some crazy left-wing kind of journal. But this is a recent report that the Productivity Commission put out called The Prison Dilemma. And what they pointed out is that in Australia, we've seen this unbelievable increase in crime between 2003 and... increase in incarceration, not increase in crime. The only countries in the world that have incarcerated at a faster rate, or that have increased at a rate faster than us, do you want to have a guess at who they are?
Oh, well, we'll throw America in there.
It's not the United States.
Really?
It's Colombia and Turkey. So we are third in the world in terms of the increase in our incarceration rate. But you would imagine that if we were increasing our incarceration rate that much, then that would be because we're responding to terrible crime.
Our crime is going up, and
in fact, there is no change in any of the major crime categories, and that's been the case for the last 20 years. Homicide rates are relatively stable. There might be a few blips, but they're relatively stable. All of the major crime categories have remained pretty much stable.
But our incarceration rates skyrocketing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and there's been lots of sort of complicated research that looks at whether or not there is a relationship between incarceration, locking people up, and crime rates.
Yeah.
And there's not. So you can see, massive increases in incarceration and decreases in crime, but they're not related to each other. You can see massive increases in crime, steady incarceration. The two things don't actually relate. What we know causes incarceration is nothing to do with crime. It's actually to do with policy, and legislative shifts and political shifts.
Yeah.
So we see increases because of changes to things like bail legislation, which are often made in politically difficult moments.
It's usually around the time of a state election when someone wants to get it tough on law and order and, oh, look, this will make me popular.
Yeah, exactly. So we've got this situation where I think we're going to look back and think, what on earth were we doing?
Well, if you break it down what you're saying there, it just doesn't make sense, does it? You look at it, and if you look at it just objectively, you're thinking something's wrong here. Something's wrong.
And I think that what we know, especially just back to that sort of that recidivism thing, so why is it the case that people keep going back to prison? Part of it's what we're talking about earlier in that, there's just not the circuit breakers, the things in place, the off-ramps, for people to actually make the kinds of changes that are required. But it's also that once you go to prison or once you come into contact with police, and even if you are sort of only coming into contact for really minor things, then the experience of incarceration itself is the biggest risk factor. It's called like a criminogenic risk factor. It's the biggest risk factor for future incarceration. So I've never been to prison, and if I was to go to prison tomorrow—
You'd be more likely to go to prison.
Yeah. So if I went to prison tomorrow, I'd have like a 50% chance of going back to prison within 2 years. But if I was somebody that had gone to prison multiple times, and I was young, which is another risk factor, if I was Aboriginal, which is another risk factor, and I'd been to prison, 6 or 7 times, then my risk of going back gets up to around 80, 90%. The more times people go to prison, the more likely they are to go back to prison. And there's a whole range of factors at play there. But so prison doesn't work in terms of recidivism. It absolutely fails.
The silence, I'm going, what do we do? But we're not, you're not advocating for no prisons.
No.
That obviously doesn't work. And I think sometimes the message that you're trying to get across gets lost because people go, oh, look at the lefty. She doesn't even want any prisons.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, but that's not what you're advocating for.
No, it's not. And I'm also not advocating that there shouldn't be accountability and that people shouldn't absolutely be held responsible for their actions. So it's not, I'm certainly not suggesting any sort of system where people do terrible things and nobody does anything.
And I think it's important to get that message across because people will shout you down going, oh, well, it'll just be anarchy on the streets if you open the prisons up. But that's not what you're saying here.
No.
You're using the data that's there to say, well, it's not working.
Yeah. And look, I don't have all of the answers either. I've got some ideas about there's a lot of evidence about what we know works in terms of reducing incarceration rates. And there is also a lot of evidence around how we could do things differently before people go into the system. So at the point of police contact, for instance, or at the point of courts, and then, of course, at the point of release. So we know that there are these touch points in the justice system where if we had sort of different things in place sort of systematically, then we would see very different outcomes.
So tell us a few of those, the touch points that we could make a difference.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, obviously, there's for kids at risk, there's lots of things that we should and could be putting in place. There's some countries that are really interesting, like New Zealand, where they have pre-charge diversion. So when kids come into contact with the police, rather than that becoming a police matter, it sort of becomes a matter that is dealt with by the community sector. Yeah. There's other, I guess, alternatives in terms of policing models and some really interesting examples coming out of the United States, I guess, who really need to sort of reflect on this. There's one model coming out of Oregon called the Cahoots Model, and what they do is they still have the same sort of 911 number, but if it's a matter which is clearly a mental health situation, so if somebody is either self-harming or threatening to self-harm or is in psychosis, rather than sending police out, so the police don't actually go out at all, trained mental health professionals, emergency mental health professionals are sent out. And I was I'm really interested in that model because police really like it.
I was going to say, you're not going to get any argument from police. We don't like, and I'm speaking on behalf of the police, but I think everyone would be, or the majority would be in agreement. The last thing we want to do is deal with people with mental health. It's difficult for us.
Absolutely.
And, we're called because there's no one else there to call.
That's right.
Then we've got to sort the problem out, and invariably it goes bad.
That's right. So looking at different models for first responders is really useful. And I with that Cahoots model, it's been going for a long time, and it's started sort of getting expanded out into different places. But it's really interesting because they get, I think it's around 25,000 calls a year or call out. So they go out to 25,000 of them. And of those, I think there is only about 300 that have actually required any kind of police involvement. So it's all been dealt with outside of the justice system. Yeah. There's other examples in terms of policing, and again, mostly from the United States, which I think are really important. And that's in a couple of places where and legislators have just decided to get rid of misdemeanor charges, right? So they've just changed the things that they're locking people up for. But the really interesting things in those examples is that not just, obviously, there's less people going to prison for misdemeanors, so things like shoplifting or, petty sort of theft or driving without a license, whatever it is. So they've sort of stopped charging people for that. But now this has been rolling out over a number of years. One of the really surprising findings from this experiment, and again, it's in a number of different places in the US, including Suffolk County and Boston's part of that, they've seen a massive reduction in violent crime as a consequence of this shift away from locking people up for misdemeanors.
That's interesting because there was a school of thought in policing, the zero tolerance. And that was something, I think it was New York that it started there, and that was, put out as this is the way to deal with it. If there's a broken window, you're going to fix it and charge the person with the vandalism, that type of thing. But this is swinging away from it.
Totally swung away. And I think there's been a recognition again of the criminogenic nature of what being in prison does. So if you go to prison for shoplifting, then you become part of that system and it gets really difficult to escape. And sometimes there is an escalation in the kinds of crimes that are being committed.
Well, I would imagine you become desensitised. Like if you've gone to prison, well, I'm a prisoner, I'm a bad guy. Well, what's it matter? I've started breaking into people's houses. Now I'm going to rob them. Yeah, who cares?
Yeah, and it is, people do, of course, learn stuff in prison from other people and learn how to get by in terms of, and again, if there's not an alternative. So, if there's not housing and there's not jobs and there's not opportunities on the outside for people to step into, then it kind of makes sense. Not that it's not to excuse it, but you can sort of understand why people would go, okay, well, this is the kind of thing I'm going to do. So, so in terms of policing, different models in terms of first responders, actually having, you can have police working alongside other kinds of healthcare professionals, making sure that people are actually diverted into appropriate service systems. So that rather than ending up at the police station, they're ending up, at a refuge for kids or at an emergency department if that's where they need to be, but not with police around them.
Makes sense. And I don't think you'd have a lot of arguments from police forces.
Yeah. And you can sort of imagine that in terms of drug and alcohol responses, in terms of disability responses, there's lots of ways in which that could happen. Another touch point is the court. So at the point that somebody actually gets to court. So, and we see this, we've got this in a number of different states and territories and a little bit in New South Wales where there's specialist courts that are, say, drug courts or that are mental health courts or that are Koori courts, where they're actually, where the magistrates are really attuned to what the circumstances are in which the crime's been committed, and the outcome, the sentencing outcome, reflects the actual needs of the person rather than it just being a punitive response.
There was someone that raised, it might have been Jaron Badgent, an Aboriginal lady that was a police officer. I think it might have been in a conversation I had with her, and she was talking about what goes on down in on the south coast of New South Wales. I think it was around Nowra, and where a young black fellow was sentenced by the courts to go fishing with an elder. Yeah. And I thought, how cool is that? That was, to me, and so you've got the elder imparting their wisdom on the young fella, and I just thought that was a great way of dealing with it, other than punishing him in some other way.
And
it's creative.
I think also that kind of those sort of like circle sentencing or restorative justice, or those alternatives to adversarial court cases where it's, us versus them. You would have seen it, of course, people when they're in an adversarial situation are always trying to minimize what it is that they did so that they can get a lesser sentence. Like that's the way that the system is set up. And then that kind of, that of course makes everybody, the victim often feels really let down by the system because they haven't had anybody actually claim or own what it is that they actually did. And then the person, doesn't get the opportunity to actually take responsibility or apologise, which actually a lot of people want to do. They want that opportunity. I mean, you don't get that in an adversarial system. In some of those other alternative, especially alternative kind of court and sentencing processes, you're actually bringing people together, say with elders or with other members of the community or victims' families. And it can be much more confronting for people than, say, going to prison and never having any contact with the people who've actually been hurt by your crime.
Ken Marslow explained something to me that was about a matter that was close to me, and I had a certain attitude. And he said, "Have you ever considered getting this person to sit down with the victim of this matter and actually admit to own what has been done?" Because I was coming in, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. And he really made me think about that. And he said, I guarantee that would be harder for the offender than you being the tough guy yelling at him or whatever you're going to do. And it made me think, and I think that is a suitable punishment. And if there is a goodness in people or an understanding or just a smidgen of empathy, it's going to have an impact on them.
And I think that, what a lot of the research around restorative justice and those processes shows is that victims often actually feel really heard, and that's one of the things that often victims complain about with the court system as it is that they don't feel like their voices are really properly in there. The way that the crimes are described doesn't really reflect what they felt and what their experience was. So I think in restorative processes, it's kind of, it's very hard for both, there's a lot of bravery required from everybody.
Confronting from both sides.
Yeah, that's right. But I think that thing of actually, apology is an amazing thing, and it's a very powerful thing, and it's actually very difficult to do if, to communicate. We're all sort of defensive and wanting to sort of minimise what it is that we've done. But I guess restorative justice actually requires this bravery of really apologising to the person or to the people that you've really hurt. And so that is a kind of mechanism. And again, it's not for everybody, and it's not.
I've been looking at restorative justice from the offender's point of view, but looking at it from the victim's point of view and the adversarial system that you're talking about, you're quite right. It would be frustrating because I see so many court matters end with the person being walked off, but still, I'm innocent. That type of thing, and that must just infuriate the victims.
It really does, and I think that and quite rightly, victims that are going through those sorts of processes often are absolutely infuriated by the minimising of what it is that's occurred, and also again that just what their voice is with there might be a victim impact statement, or there might be an opportunity to sort of talk about the impact of the crime, but it's not it's often not as kind of, it's not on their terms. It's sort of within this very strict kind of framework. And I guess that some of those other kinds of processes actually allow them to look somebody in the eye as well, which is a very powerful thing. Often also what can happen is that the person, even though, again, it's not excusing the crime, but the person can explain what was happening to them at the time that they committed the crime. And that context can be really empowering because it can sort of take away the sense that a lot of victims have that it's their fault, that they've done something wrong. That's
a powerful thing that you're saying there.
And when people can sort of hear that, look, you happened to be there at that particular moment, or your house happened to be there, or your car happened to be there, and this had been my day. This is what happened at 10 o'clock, and this is what I was drinking at midday, and this is, these are all the different steps, and then you happen to be the person that I came across.
Yeah.
It really, on one level, it depersonalizes it for the victim of the crime, but it also it personalizes it for the offender, for the person that's offended. So they have to see the impact of it.
But because it's always saddened me, and I say it to victims quite often because sometimes they blame themselves for what's happened.
Yeah.
And you're the victim. But unless it's explained to them from the offender's point of view, they probably don't see it. So that's another tick for that type of approach.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, I think that there's what the Justice Reform Initiative is sort of saying is, look, there's not one magic fix, but there are lots of different things that we know that have like real evidence base. There's lots of really smart people that have been researching the stuff literally for decades.
Yeah.
So we've got a pretty good sense of, say, stuff around policing, what could be done differently. We've got a good idea that
And you've got some very smart, prominent people in there.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've looked at who's associated with it.
Yeah, it's really...
So you've got a good brains trust there.
Yeah, so there's, I think, 120 patrons that have come together for this, and it's growing. And within that, there's 2 former Governor-Generals that are heading up the thing. So Dame Quentin Bryce and Sir William Dean are sort of the chief patrons. But then in every state and territory, we've got former political leaders, a lot of former judges and magistrates, a lot of amazing Aboriginal leaders and elders. We've got sort of also people that have been kind of leaders in the community in sort of justice-related issues, but from all sides of politics. So, we've got former Liberal
and you're really looking for a bipartisan approach to it.
We absolutely need it because too often this issue, has been one which has been a defining point of a lot of state elections, especially, and both sides have been terrible. There's no political party that you can look at and go, oh, you've got a good record on this.
It frustrated me from a police officer point of view when I was watching ministers talk about we're going to get tough on crime just because that was what people wanted to hear, but it was not going to have any effect. And you're quite right. You need that. You need people to take the politics out of it. And
that's a huge part of what we're trying to do. And having all of those sort of patrons, we're hoping is going to actually really, we're having lots of meetings with members of parliament and ministers and trying to sort of at this stage really just say, look, even if we just have this next, South Australia's got an election soon and, a number of states have elections coming up. If we manage to not have a law and order election, we are going to be in a better position than if we do because terrible policy is made during those elections and terrible promises are made during those elections and it doesn't make the community safer. So, and I think we're getting somewhere with that. I think there's been some real, some states and territories a long way to go. But that competition to see who can be tougher is just it's a political sort of game.
The fact that you've got so many people from, prominent people, but people from different areas all looking at the same thing, as we said at the start of the podcast, it really is a powerful push.
Absolutely.
Isn't it?
There's patrons that we have where, I don't think I would have almost anything in common with, apart from the fact that we all want to reduce the numbers of people in custody. It really is. It's a real mix, and I think that it has to be that because one of the things is, I guess, that a lot of people in Australia don't know much about incarceration, don't know much about the prison system. And we've done some market research and found that people are really shocked when they find out that actually it doesn't work to do all of the things that, we expect it to, and it doesn't make the community safer. So having all of these different voices, I think, is really important. Like this isn't an issue that is just, about kind of like you were saying, like a few lefties kind of jumping up and down. Like this is actually the communities where there's the highest crime rates are also the communities where there are most people going to prison. Yeah. So again,
it's in everyone's interest.
It's in everyone's interest.
So you can't be written off as a inner city trendy that's just you've got people from all areas coming in saying that's onto something. The touch points you talked about the young people. And the courts, is there other?
Yeah, that point of release is another really critical touch point in terms of turning things around or possibly being a circuit breaker. And one of the reasons for that, and I experienced a lot of this when I was working at CRC, is that people often at the end of their prison sentences are in often quite an optimistic sort of frame of mind. They're often quite excited about getting out, terrified about getting out.
It makes sense, yeah.
But they're, and they're often, if their lives have been very chaotic, which usually they have been before they went to prison, and lots of drug use and often untreated mental illness and all the rest of it, often by the end of their sentence things have stabilised a little bit, and they're just in a healthier sort of space to make some decisions. And that's often when you can talk to people about who they want to be, what they want to do, what they would like their life on the outside to look like. And I think you were talking about it before. So many people just say, I just want to have a normal life. I just want my life to be normal. Like I don't even, like, people don't quite know how to do that, but that's what they want. But that's also the time when people will often say, oh, I've got an aunt in Dubbo that I'd really like to reconnect with, or I've got my forklift ticket and I really want to do this kind of work. And you start getting kind of hooks, I guess, about what it is that you're going to hold on to when things get really tricky on the outside. So you sort of build a bit of a picture with that person around, how their lives might unfold. So that point, people can make, people can have imagination about who they want to be, and then if there's someone there to kind of support them with that and to hold them to that, then you've got a pretty good chance of actually breaking the cycle at that point.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, they're all valid points, and it doesn't seem too hard to achieve. What in incarceration? Well, I think it's 3.6 billion that's spent.
It's actually more now. So the most recent Productivity Commission report had it at about 5.2. So it's right. It's like that's across Australia.
Can we break it down? How much does it cost for each person in prison? You've got a rough idea?
Yeah, look, I mean, it's different depending on security levels, and kids are super expensive. Yeah. But around 100,000 per person. Yeah. And and much more for that's over the course of a year. So much more for particular security classifications.
You could almost
of young people.
Have every person with their own dedicated psychologist working with them for that.
Almost
money.
Any system would be cheaper. Almost any system that we design.
Maybe that's the push. Like everyone's always about finance and economics, but economically it makes sense to do something different.
Well, look, we're counting when we look at the thing the $5 billion is just the actual cost of running the prisons themselves. That doesn't include any of the, say, insurance costs,
the
costs of crime, the social costs, the hospital costs, all of the things that come along with that.
What's the alternative to putting people in prison? Someone's committed a crime. They would get a prison sentence. What would your argument be that they shouldn't go to prison? This would be an alternative.
I think we've got some really good ones that exist already. So sometimes it is around, people can be sentenced to drug and alcohol treatment. So that's like one option. Sometimes you can sort of defer the sentence and actually see how people go with different kinds of support in the community. Right. And that's often a really successful model.
So it's hanging over their head and it's get your life in order. Yeah. This is your time to make
And a lot of magistrates and judges.
That would be a strong motivation.
A lot of magistrates and judges love that approach, but they just don't have the services available to refer people to those kinds of orders. So one of the, most frustrating things at the moment is just that, again, I was sort of saying CRC maybe works with 500 people a year. Yeah. One of the things that I think that in terms of building an alternative system is if we start thinking, well, imagine if, every sort of dude that said to me, where were you, when I first got out? Imagine if those 20,000 people that are coming in and out of prison each year, for those people that needed help, imagine if that was available. So imagine if everybody that put up their hand for, say, some post-release support was actually able to receive it. Imagine if everybody who really wanted help with their drug and alcohol addiction, and that is around 70% of people that are in prison for reasons related to drug and alcohol use. Imagine if we could actually just refer people to drug and alcohol services.
And the services were there.
there. The reality at the moment is the services are just not there. And if you're in a regional remote area, then there's just nothing. So, or imagine if you're going through a real mental health crisis, and in fact, one of the reasons you're in prison is because of your mental health and you want support. Imagine if that support was there. To me, it's actually mind-boggling that we've got a system where it is a matter of luck if you happen to get the service that you need.
Yeah, and I do appreciate how difficult it is because there's one prisoner, offender, I don't know how to describe him, interesting character that's played a fairly prominent part throughout my career. He just sort of pops up. It's like we're meant to, our paths are meant to cross. But his partner was trying to get him into a drug and alcohol rehabilitation. He was out and trying everywhere, and to the point where I was picking up the phone and going, please, could you do this, trying to help in the little way that I could. And I remember her frustration. She's saying, if we could just get him there, he'll be fine. And it couldn't get him in, and he's back inside now.
Yeah, but that's a more common story than a not common story.
Yeah,
I think it's that thing, and you observe it after sort of enough years in this system where it is just a matter of luck whether or not somebody happens to be in a prison and they happen to get referred and there happens to be a place. But that doesn't happen systematically. So imagine if we had a system where actually everybody that did come into contact with the police then was given the option of, look, you look like you really need some help with your mental health.
Yeah.
We're going to not just dump you at emergency, but actually make sure that you get ongoing help for your mental health.
Well, I know, and I hadn't been frontline police for a long time in uniform, but it was probably 10 years ago. I was working in a local area command, so I was seeing the work that the uniform police were doing, and the frustration of dealing with the mental health issues, taking whoever you had to respond to the hospital. The person's released, and then you're doing it again. You might do it two or three times in one shift.
Yeah.
The same person, because there just wasn't the facilities to deal with the situation.
Yeah, that's right. And look, and I know it's not the whole answer. So there's still the question of, what about, people that, community really needs to be protected from. But I guess the reason that I'm very keen to focus on these sorts of solutions is because we know they work. They're actually
that's always a good argument. That's a hard one to debate.
Yeah, and also I guess politically it's not a really risky thing. You're not going to be seen to be sort of not tough on crime. You're just seen to be sort of actually building services.
Thinking if a politician could articulate what you're articulating during this chat, people might go, that makes sense. Instead of standing there like a tough guy, we're going to do this, we're going to crack down on crime, and I just shake my head at those types when they say that. There's not a lot that you can argue against what you're saying. But I think the strength of your argument is that you're saying it's not perfect. Like it will improve it. It won't solve everything approaching it this way, but we can make improvements. And I think that's an important part of it too.
Yeah, that's right. Look, there's stuff, say, raising the age of criminal responsibility, bail legislation reform, sentencing reform. So there's technical sort of legislative shifts that also need to happen. And that's part of the work that I'm doing as well. But I think it really is around this idea that actually the solutions to most of the problems of the criminal justice system exist outside of the criminal justice system. So we can't expect corrections to be the institution that sort of solves everything.
Yeah, well, that's right. Their role is we want you to keep these people contained.
Yeah.
And the role of the police is if someone commits an offence, we want you to put them before the courts.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think, so it's actually, everybody's got some responsibility for a particular role, but this part, is the missing part, which is we've got all these people that end up being managed in this justice system setting that actually should be getting support in the community. And again, that's not bleeding heart stuff. That's just what the stats show us in terms of the demographics of who goes to prison. And we've also got all of this sort of, really interesting life course research that sort of tracks the trajectories of people that are born into circumstances of disadvantage. And I guess that what we can see really clearly from that is, if I was born with a disability, as we've talked about, in a really disadvantaged community, then chances are that my disability would never be diagnosed. Any support or learning needs I had wouldn't necessarily be kind of catered to. People would maybe sort of think some of my behaviour was a bit odd, but wouldn't necessarily do anything about it. And if it was an over-policed community, then likely I'd be in trouble with the police before I received any supports. But if I was born into a wealthy community with that same sort of disability, chances are I'd get supports wrapped around me, and I would have advocacy so that I could get what I needed in order to, have the opportunity to get
there is a disadvantage for certain people, and that brings me to a quote that I was looking at again on your website, but I'll read it out and we'll talk about that. Another disturbing fact how prisons operate in this state, as well as throughout the entire country, is that being used to warehouse disadvantaged populations, the poor, the unemployed, the homeless, and people living with mental illness and cognitive disabilities. So that's right at the point that you're talking about there.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, again, I'm pretty sure we're going to look back on this era of incarceration with especially of kids, and just be a bit horrified that this is how we responded to it. Because, again, I don't want to minimise crime and I don't want to minimise the impact of that. But, again, there's just this, if we look at what the social drivers are of why people end up in custody, and it's not to say that, of course, there are people born into extraordinarily difficult circumstances who don't ever commit crime. But given what we know about the populations that do end up in prison in terms of the numbers of people that do have not just a mental illness, but a mental illness and a disability, and that have, had intergenerational poverty and have had mum and dad in prison and all the rest of it, then the question for us as a community, I think, has to be not, how do we punish them better, but how do we actually, again, provide an off-ramp or a opportunity so that if that person does decide, and people often do decide they want to do things differently, when they make that decision, there is actually an option for them
and
at the moment, and support for them. At the moment, people can make that decision and they've got nothing, like the guy that you're just talking about trying to help get into a rehab. It's like people make that decision, they're ready, they're hungry to make a change, and they can't get the help that they need. Yeah,
and that's the frustrating part is there. It's so easy to fall back into old habits then.
Yeah.
And that's, I would dare say when we talk about the recidivist, the high rate, well, okay, I've tried, and you push back. You have low self-esteem to start with, I would imagine, coming out of prison. I've tried. This is a crook. My papers are marked, and they fall back into that. We talk about the high incarceration rate of Indigenous people, and I think they're the most incarcerated people on earth. 3% of our population in Australia are Indigenous, and but they form 29% of the adult prison population. What's your thoughts on that? It's sad, and
it's incredibly sad, and I guess that it's very difficult to really frame that as anything aside from a pretty clear case of institutional racism, and a clear history of what colonisation's actually meant for Indigenous people. I feel like, again, I think I said, Aboriginal leaders and communities have absolutely sort of been bearing the weight of our appetite for over-incarceration, and have been absolutely sort of leading the way in terms of advocacy, and have been shouting about this and writing about this and thinking about this and pleading with government about this for decades. We're 30 years on from the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, and all of those recommendations, are still just sitting there. So I guess that, the Robert Tickner, who started the Justice Reform Initiative, he was the Aboriginal Affairs Minister at the time in the Keating government, responsible for the implementation of those recommendations.
Right.
And I think a large motivating factor for him was looking at, in fact, how things haven't got better. Things have got worse. We're incarcerating more and more Aboriginal people. And, really sort of is I guess, a lot of what we're trying to do is to support that leadership and to sort of also say to the community, this isn't just an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander issue. This is something that all of us need to take some responsibility for. But all of those things, like all of those social drivers in terms of disadvantage, like that's the situation for so many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. Plus, there's this other layer of the policing and how people are treated in courts and how people are treated in prisons, and the kind of, I guess, relentless ongoing kind of intergenerational trauma of the impact of that system.
Yeah, and I think people don't appreciate that trauma that's inherited, it's come through. But it's something's got to be done about it. We've got to break the cycle somehow.
Yeah, and look, I mean, I guess the thing is that, you know, from the perspective of somebody who's, you know, running a white organisation with some incredible Aboriginal patrons and Aboriginal sort of board members, you know, assisting with this, one of the things that I think that we do need to do is really recognise that the Aboriginal leadership on this stuff has been staunch. Like and a lot of the sort of answers are absolutely there and have been absolutely advocated for such a long time. So I see a large part of my role, or, you know, a significant part of my role, as being around pointing people again in the direction of where those answers are. And again, Aboriginal communities know how to reduce Aboriginal incarceration.
And exactly. And it's interesting you say that, because they're the ones that, if we go, oh, how are we going to solve this? Well, we're white people.
Yeah. And
the Aboriginal people have got a clear understanding of what their communities need. Yeah. I'm in absolute admiration of a person that I've got to know quite well of recent times, Shane Phillips, who runs Tribal Warrior in Redfern. Yeah. Just amazing the work he does. I thought I was a crime fighter. I think he's done more in reducing crime than I could ever have done.
You know, and that sort of stuff as well. Like I know of Shane and his work and know lots of people that have been to his gym and, you know.
Just simple, practical stuff.
Simple, practical stuff. And I don't know if he does evaluations of that work, but I think, you know, when we're talking about evidence and what works, and, you know, there's also stuff that we need to kind of look at that makes so much sense. And I guess anecdotally we hear about people that, you know, whose lives are completely turned around through sport or through music or through, again, those things that are about an identity outside of the justice system. We don't always have a heap of research on that, but I think we need to have some sort of bravery around going, this seems like it's making a really big difference for a lot of people that come through it. Maybe we could look at, you know, whether that's sort of scalable, is that stuff that could happen in other communities?
I've had long chats with him, and I think it's transferable in other areas, other situations. Yeah. But the basics of it, I went to one of his boxing sessions with the community people. It was so impressive. I just walked away inspired, and the pride that he instilled in the community there, and it was just beautiful. What he was doing, and I know how hard he works. So
I think there are examples like that. I think around Australia of communities and community leaders, Aboriginal communities and community leaders doing amazing work, often on the smell of an oily rag. You know, like with not a lot of resourcing. I think that what hasn't happened has been a kind of resourcing commitment from government and political will in order to kind of
a lot of what we talk about here is having those resources and that will to make the change. And what's the we talked at the start about Netherlands, the prison system there. What do you like about that?
Well, I guess it's hard to talk about prisons as being good places because, you know, they're all prisons, and, you know, they're punishing environments regardless of how lovely they are.
As an ex-cop, I've been desensitised. So is that a good prison?
I know. Like
I know what you're saying. You're quite right.
But
if we had no prisons, if we had no need for a prison, that would be the perfect world.
Yeah, that's right, of course. But I guess that what you can see in some of the prisons, especially in sort of Scandinavian countries, is a very different relationship between staff and people who are in prison. I mean, there's a whole different welfare system that's sort of behind it as well. So there's a different kind of approach to I guess, a more of a sense that people are deserving of their rights, and that sort of stays with you when you go to prison. But I think that in the Netherlands you can see this principle at play that we are technically supposed to have in Australia, which is that the loss of liberty is the punishment, and that there shouldn't be punishment beyond that. So there shouldn't be the dehumanising sort of structures that we currently have in place.
Simple principle, but
Yeah. So, you know, there's still prisons. People can't sort of escape. But the environment in which people are actually living is very different.
It's almost like a community environment.
It's like a community. And I think that and again, there has been a fair bit of research and comparative work done, treating people, with respect and with dignity, and having an actual physical environment that isn't brutal, and having interactions with staff where, half the time people aren't wearing uniforms and you're calling each other by their first names. All of that humanises people in a way that we just don't do in Australia.
And to me, it makes sense that the people that come from the prison, that type of environment, would integrate back into society a lot easier than someone that's been locked up and been called by a number.
Absolutely. And there's also amazing sort of, I guess peer-led or ex-prisoner-led programs where people that are leaving prison are sort of matched up with mentors that have absolutely, done a lot of time and know even in sort of these kinds of good prison places, leaving prison is still a complicated process. So having people that have experienced it also being there to support you kind of through that process, but also having a welfare system that is actually going to sort of bolster whatever your needs are until you get on your feet, which is, again, something that we just don't really have in Australia. It's pretty, you sort of walk out and there's not a lot there for you. But I think the key thing is that and again, I don't want to sound like a big hippie, but actually treating people in a humane way, regardless of what it is that they have done, and recognising that the punishment for what they've done is in the process of incarceration or the incarceration itself. It shouldn't be a daily kind of perpetual punishment in terms of, being treated either with disrespect or, in worst case scenarios, with a lot of violence, being treated, not having your health needs met, not having your basic needs met in terms of, say, medication, which are all things that people experience in Australian prisons. So it's a very different way of framing what punishment actually entails.
Well, I don't think you're coming across as a hippie. You're coming across with some sound logic. It's hard to poke holes in what you're saying because it does seem fairly simple when you're explaining it that way.
Yeah, and I think, when you talk to people here that have been through therapeutic centres, we've had a few of them in New South Wales, and I think that people that have experienced that different kind of imprisonment often talk about that as being quite transformative and very, very different from, say, just, your regular kind of Bathurst or Goulburn kind of type environment. So, I think we've tried to do little bits and pieces of it. And again, I don't want to sort of suggest that there's, prison is going to be tough regardless of what it looks like. But if we are going to put people in prison, then again, I think what we need to be asking is, well, what sort of situation do we want these people to be in when they're released? Because almost everybody is coming out. And I think that regardless of how tough on crime you want to be, if you want your community to be safer, then you've actually got to make
And what's the point of being tough on crime if it's not about making the community safer? Otherwise, it's just revenge or sadistic. Like that's what gets me. Like I can't see a flaw in the argument, because if we want to reduce crime to make society safer, well, that's what it should be about.
Yeah, that's right.
That's their focus. Look, I've found it fascinating chatting, and I think having sat down with you and you explain it so clearly, that I think there might be a lot of people that might want to get involved. How would you steer people to do the type? I think you may have inspired people to get involved. So
we would love as many people to get involved as possible. We're really keen for this to be something that people haven't necessarily thought about prisons, or that want to learn more to get involved. So you can sign up to become a supporter on the Justice Reform Initiative website. So if you just Google "jailing is failing," you'll find us.
That's a good catchphrase.
And then there's there'll be volunteer opportunities available as well, and there'll be donation opportunities if people want to throw some money to this effort. But I guess that, really what I'm looking to do is, and what the Justice Reform Initiative is looking to do, is to really sort of have these conversations with people from all around Australia. So, we want to be talking to Rotary clubs and Lions clubs and country women's associations. We want to be talking to anybody who will listen, business chambers, police associations. We want to be starting to get, again, this sort of idea of evidence-based justice policy as something that's just a normalised part of the way that we think about how to respond to crime. And we want to, try and get bring people along with us to try and shift this kind of political addiction and media addiction to sort of tough on crime, sort of sensationalist type reporting.
Well, you've convinced me.
Great, fantastic.
So that you've got
sign
one.
Up.
That's one. Tick.
Excellent.
What do you do outside of this to relax for it, because it's fairly intense and you throw a lot of effort in there? How do you balance it out?
Well, look, I mean, I spend time with my teenage children. That's not necessarily the most relaxing. That's not that relaxing. Look, I'm a musician as well, so I've always sort of played music outside of completely outside of this world, and it's quite a nice way to sort of, if things are really tough in a paid work kind of context, I can sort of do a gig and go, oh, I've got this other thing that I've got going on. Or if things are really terrible with music, I can be like, well, I'm doing all this work with prisons, so both of those things.
Well, I won't embarrass you by asking you to steer people in that direction,
No.
But if you do Google the name, you will find Mindy and her musical talents, which are very impressive.
I can't believe I get a plug for that as well.
We haven't had anyone sing on I Catch Killers. You don't want to be the first?
No, definitely not.
I thought
trying to keep these worlds, trying to keep my professional sort of world very separate from my kind of, singing to drunken people in bars and Marrickville world kind of apart.
Okay. Well, look, thanks so much for coming on. I've really enjoyed the chat, and you've explained things so clearly, and I think what you're doing is really worthwhile. So keep up the good work.
Fantastic.
Thanks for coming on.
Thanks so much, Gary. Thanks for having me.
Cheers.